All right. People are joining in and trickling in, but I think we'll begin in the interest of time. Thank you for joining us. Today's event is States, Markets, and Foreign Aid, an author chat with Simone Dietrich. My name is Malvika Rendive. I am the program coordinator at SID-United States, and thank you for being here today. Before we kind of hand it out to our speakers, I am going to go over some housekeeping rules for today. Just a brief introduction for SID-United States. If you're not familiar with us, we are the largest and the most active chapter of the Society for International Development, an international network that was founded in 1957 to serve as a forum dedicated to sustainable economic, social, and political development. We serve as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together people from diverse organizations, disciplines, and career stages in a neutral and independent forum to share information and discuss important issues, challenges facing our community, as we are doing today. There are different ways that you can get involved with us. You can check out our upcoming events and sign up for a weekly newsletter at sid-us.org. You can also apply to be an intern or volunteer co-chair, and we also have multiple other volunteer opportunities opening up soon. You will also find information on this on our website. And you can also follow us on social media to stay updated on all our activity. A few things to note for today's event. This will be a recorded session and it will be shared publicly through our networks and social media channels. Live transcription closed captioning is available and it can be turned on through your own personal settings. Please make sure to post your questions in the Q&A box, and you can also address it to a specific speaker. We may not be able to answer all questions in this case, and apologies for that, but in the interest of time, that is a possibility. As I mentioned earlier, please refrain from having conversations in the chat box and kind of limit your questions to the Q&A box. I will now turn it over to Dr. Annette Brown, Principal Economist and Acting Head of Strategy for FHI 360, and our moderator for today.
Thank you very much, Malavika, and welcome everyone to this SID-US event. As Malavika said, I'm Annette Brown, and I'm the Principal Economist at FHI 360 and also currently our Head of Strategy. I am very pleased today to introduce and to have a discussion with Professor Simone Dietrich. Professor Dietrich is currently Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, but she's held academic positions at University of Essex, University of Missouri, and also at Princeton University. But before she became a full-time academic, she served as a practitioner working in our industry in the Caucasus, the Balkans, and Central Asia. And I think you'll hear when you listen to her talk about her research on foreign aid, that those experiences really helped to guide her insights into the importance of the organizations and the individuals in the organizations for understanding decision-making in foreign aid. Now, Professor Dietrich has recently, not as recently anymore, published this great book that we're going to talk about today. She's also published numerous journal articles in international journals. One of the things that I really love about Simone's work, and that you'll also realize in listening to her today, is that she uses a mixed methods, or what she calls a multi-methods approach to her research, meaning that she collects very rich, interesting quantitative data sets that allow her to do quantitative analysis and really give us pictures of the evidence behind the arguments that she makes. But she also complements that with very rich qualitative data. For this book, she conducted dozens of interviews with aid officials across multiple donor agencies. And that really helps to fill out the arguments that she's making. One last thing I'll say in introduction is that this book and Simone were recently awarded co-winner of the Best Book Award by the American Political Science Association International Collaboration Section. So we're very fortunate to get to hear about the book today from her and to be able to discuss it with her. After she gives a brief introduction to her book, I have some questions I'm going to ask her, but please put your questions in the Q&A box and I'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So Simone, Professor Dietrich, over to you.
Thank you, Annette, for this kind introduction, and thank you to the Society for International Development US for hosting this event and making it possible. I'm now going to share my screen with you to offer some slides as we go along. And so I also thanks to the audience for coming, and I look forward to this discussion. And as was said in the introduction, feel free to put questions in the chat or email me directly. Now let me turn to my book. It is still quite recent. It came out in December 2021, and so I think it's still a good time to get it into the open. And books are big, but I'm going to now try and distill it into 15 minutes where I would like to motivate the research question, present the argument, describe my empirical strategy and the findings, and then also really distill the extent to which the book informs current debates on foreign aid effectiveness, donor coordination, and more broadly, the future of aid. And so my book asks the following question: why do donor countries, and here I talk about the 23 traditional DAC donor countries, engage in markedly different development tactics? This is an empirical puzzle where we can see that, for example, in countries that are poorly governed, donors like the United States, the UK, or Scandinavian countries, among others, tend to bypass more, that is, tend to work and delegate aid through non-state actors, be it private sector or not-for-profit, while other donors under the same circumstances choose to engage more with the recipient government. And so the question of the book is why do we observe these differences? Now, in a first step, let me define what I mean when I talk about bypassing authorities or engaging with authorities. On the left side, you see a picture of a government building in Sri Lanka, which signals, and this could really be anywhere in the developing world, engagement with recipient authorities in the implementation of aid. And so this could be project aid, budget support, programmable aid that draws in public sector officials and staff in the implementation. And the idea here is to bring in local gravitas and expertise to really develop aid in ways that can be effective. On the other hand, on the right side, you have screenshots of actors, different development actors that I put in the bypass category. And the term bypass refers to a first instance of delegation when donor governments delegate funds or the implementation to players like Chemonics that represent the for-profit world, or Care International that represent the not-for-profit space, or organizations like Gavi that represent the public-private partnership space, or you could imagine other logos by IO trust funds that draw in or that have really increased and moved into the development space to capture available funding. The idea here is, and an argument for bypass, is that in contexts where we have weak or fragile state institutions, governments might not be the best partners to bring development about, and therefore the delegation to these non-state actors makes it more likely that aid gets to the people who need it. And so this is an argument for bypass. Now, if this went the wrong direction. Both approaches have their objectives, but they also come with trade-offs. And so on the left side, you see, for example, a picture of a PEPFAR clinic in Mozambique that treats a young patient with HIV, who has HIV/AIDS. And we see in the background resources, plenty of resources to combat HIV/AIDS. Now, PEPFAR, as you probably all know, is a targeted vertical health program put in place in 2003 by George W. Bush, whose objective is to combat HIV/AIDS, and which serves as a prime example for bypass. In the US, PEPFAR has been considered a golden goose in the development space, annually funded above levels requested by the government. And it is a particularly popular program because it has managed to make aid legibly to the domestic audience, to critics, on an annual basis by counting the numbers of lives saved and while fulfilling important efficiency and value for money criteria that can score points even with aid critics. On the other hand, you have a photo of a government-run clinic that should just sort of capture, in this particular instance, capacity issues. In this case, we can see that the clinic doesn't manage to provide adequate treatment for maternal care throughout a woman's pregnancy. This is a women's clinic, or we can also think of clinics that tackle important health issues like diabetes that are often underfunded or don't have enough funding to provide people with care. And so studies have even documented most recently that these vertical health programs not only demonstrate inequalities across the healthcare space, but that they actually work through phenomena such as brain drain, actually make it harder for public health clinics like the one on the right side to maintain or improve its quality. Doctors move from what is often underfunded to well-funded vertical health interventions. And so there are trade-offs that come with bypass that donors care about. There are trade-offs that come with government-to-government aid. You've all heard of instances of aid capture through recipient authorities. There is a recent study by Anderson et al. That shows that aid dependence or the aid disbursements to highly aid-dependent countries coincide with sharp increases in bank deposits in offshore financial centers known for bank secrecy. So the idea here is that aid gets transferred to pockets and enriches individuals. And Montinola and Kono have shown that aid can stabilize autocrats in the long run because they can stockpile aid for use against negative economic shocks that might threaten their grip on power. And so again, there are trade-offs associated with government-to-government aid. And when we look empirically now at how donors position themselves on the bypass or government-to-government spectrum, we see, as I said in the beginning, that there are significant differences in how they position themselves. And so these preferences are quite stable over time and over the last decade, I should say. And so the argument that explains why these differences happen, why donors like the US, UK, and Scandinavia bypass more in low quality of governance environments than other donors is really a story about the domestic political context in donor countries. And in my book, I suggest that we can find the answer to this question by looking at the by looking at aid agencies as domestic agencies first. And so when we look at aid agencies, I think of aid officials in these aid agencies or relevant ministries that disperse aid as key actors whose decisions on bypass or engage help us explain the puzzle. But it's important to say that these decisions have less to do with how aid officials want to promote aid at any given moment, or what the aid industry deems as most effective at any given moment, but rather it has its origin in the organization or the bureaucratic organization of the aid agency. Or more specifically, what kinds of rule books structure accountability within these organizations, how they're set up and guided to address risk in foreign aid implementation, and how they ensure accountability. And by looking at that, we can get a sense of how donors position themselves on the bypass versus engage continuum. And so the idea is that across donors, and now moving from the cross-country to the over time, we see that up until the 70s or 80s, we actually note that aid donors used to deliver aid primarily through the government to government sector. But then as the crisis of the welfare state hits across countries, some donor governments like the United States, the United Kingdom, and later also Scandinavian countries try to solve the challenges of that come with globalization by dismantling the state, and not only in the foreign aid, but across the board. And so this solution to the welfare state crisis then trickles across the various ministries, and ultimately, and this is the argument, also affects how donor governments interact with recipient governments today and still today. So think about the USAID as a prime aid implementing or as a primary agency of international development. It used to be an organization that deployed its staff across the world. Today, it's moved from rowing to steering, to borrow from a term in the public administration literature, and has essentially evolved into a management agency. And so that manages contracts and ensures accountability. And so this bureaucratic solution to the challenge of globalization, right, the dismantlement and the introduction of managerialism across the public sector via rule books that mimic private sector governance, which is sort of all captured by this term managerialism, that emphasizes incentives, competition, and performance, all to minimize risk in aid delivery, and via the design of manageable projects that are evaluated and measured in regular intervals using quantitative indicators that often black box country contexts and that don't necessarily allow for programming to account for non-linear processes. And so the hypothesis coming out of this would that, especially in countries where there are problems of governance, accountability per se is already complicated, but managerial donors or donors that have adopted a managerial logic in their bureaucratic organization are going to tend to bypass more and work more through non-state actors to circumvent aid capture through recipient authorities. There is a over time element in this. As I've said, the transition from a bigger bureaucracy to a slim bureaucracy over the course of the last 40 years also has led to a shift in how donors, managerial donors like the United States, have shifted from state to state or government to government to bypass. And so here you can see the aid official, and this, I found this picture not too long ago, who is now shifting from government to government interactions to directly financing schools through non-state actors. Now, quickly, my empirical strategy, as I said, I have different types of data that I analyze. So at first, I have cross-country analysis of commitments, annual commitments, where I find that controlling for factors that could also account for bypass or engage. I like, for example, strategic or non-developmental factors. Neoliberal donors commit more aid in bypass form than their traditional public sector counterparts. This is on average, and it plays out if we only looking at low quality countries with that score low on the quality of governance scale. Now, I've also conducted over 60 closed-ended interviews with aid officials across the US, UK, Sweden, Germany, and France. I then estimated the same, I did the same quantitative analysis mirroring the country level data. And I found the same pattern when learning about the recipient country having a poor quality of governance environment. Then donors that fit in the managerial camp, including Anglo-Saxon donors and Scandinavian donors, prefer more aid to go through bypass channels than their traditional public counterparts under the same condition. And then finally, I also look at public opinion towards bypass and engage. And if it could be possible that the reason why aid officials do bypass or more engage is because this kind of decision is broadly supported across population. But what I find is that both in a managerial state in the US and a traditional public sector donor in Germany, publics want to punish recipient governments when they learn about poor governance, and so it suggests that these decisions are not driven by the public, but rather by the rule books. And so additionally, I did comparative research on the organization of aid bureaucracies across 5 donors in depth. And there too, I show that over time then, so post 1945 and onwards, the introduction of managerial practices has led to more outsourcing. So there it's a more qualitative engagement with the data. Now, what are the implications of this? Ideological beliefs or ideas that were considered solutions to the welfare state crisis and that were locked in decades ago shape donor decisions about how aid gets delivered today. So there's a historical explanation. They also shape these ideas, these beliefs shape the mandate, objective, and metrics used to document aid success. So a managerial organization operates on much shorter time horizons than the typical traditional public sector organization. And these rules produce policy and decisions that are sticky. And it's difficult to deviate from them because aid officials are incentivized to work in line with the rule book. This also means that in order for new ideas or innovation to become practical, and also for innovation to persist, it has to chive with or align with the underlying ideological orientation of the rule book. So promoting budget support in a managerial organization is very difficult because it really runs counter to this particular institutional setup. Paradigmatic changes, so changes that stick in the aid industry or even in the bilateral aid program, need to be sort of go hand in hand with rules, with changes to the rule book. And ultimately, if we look at the range of donors that are out there, these institutional rule books also tell us something about what these aid agencies are set up to do expertly. And so managerial and aid organizations really do well on short-term aid delivery, right? That maximizes efficiency and getting aid to the people, while aid organizations, aid setups of more traditional public sector donors are better at bringing in the public sector. And so there's opportunity actually moving forward for donors to recognize these as comparative advantages and maybe to move ahead together. But what we actually see today is that the like-minded donors who share the same orientation and whose organizations are structured in a similar way are actually more likely to coordinate. So the same ideas bring donors together and make them more likely to cooperate. And then finally, and this is partly related to the research I do currently, is that these different orientations and these different organizational structures also make it more complicated at the global level to come up with principles around which the donor community really comes together and rallies together, or define what it is that constitutes best development practices. Because for managerial donors, results are very important, right? And so they're going to promote best practices that ensure that results can be demonstrated and even better demonstrated, while other donors who have less a focus on the short run, right, are more likely to prioritize principles such as country ownership that operate or allow for slightly longer time horizons as when we think about aid assessments. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with Annette.
Great, thank you so much. So we don't have any questions from the audience yet, so that means I get to ask some of the questions that I have been waiting to ask you about this book. I want to pick up kind of where you left off, which is, and how you say it in the book is, aid success means different things to aid officials from different political economies. And you were giving the example right at the end that if we think about the managerial political economies, aid success means something that needs to be measured by metrics or indicators in a certain period of time, and that's less true in a government engagement model. However, as you note in the book, that you say there's a global proliferation of performance indicators. And certainly we see that with the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals, that this idea of establishing indicators and measuring them is something that the whole world is supposed to get around. So on the one hand, that feels to me like moving towards managerialism, although on the other hand, many of those indicators are supposed to be measured at the country level, i.e. produced by governments. So I'm curious whether this proliferation of indicators, whether these SDGs actually, do you think that they're going to move donors more collectively towards a managerialism focus, or they can be interpreted by different donors in different ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is, I like this question because it's first of all, it hasn't really been answered empirically, right? And I sort of raise it as a possibility in the book. And it's research that I'm currently working on in my research team, and that asks the question, do these goals, like as you say, MDGs and SDGs, first of all, do they put pressure on traditional public sector donors? That is, do they perceive them as metrics that they need to engage with, right? And then does this pressure then encourage governments to change their way of doing development? And so we see already that, and this is data I show in the book, that donors that systematically adopt these managerial rule books are then more likely to work around public sectors in recipient governments. So as more countries adopt these reforms comprehensively, we will see more bypass. If we look, and this is largely anecdotal in this point, but it will become more systematic in terms of an evidence base. Through my interviews, I actually have preliminary support, again, anecdotally, that it is true that talking to German, French, and even Japanese officials, they feel that they need to be part of that conversation of global metrics. And so what we see is that there are very punctuated efforts across these aid agencies to create ways and systems that allow them to be part of that measuring process, and to be able to show progress on the MDGs, on the SDGs, or whatever metric one is referring to. But whether these punctuated reforms then actually lead to some, like a systematic pattern towards more bypass, that is an open question, and that needs to be investigated a little bit more thoroughly. And as a last point to this, what I've actually noticed is that there is a bit of a difference or a recognition that wasn't there when they produced the MDGs, that is part, that really features very prominently in the SDGs, and that is the notion that these increasingly complex social, environmental, or economic challenges need to have governments, recipient governments, in the equation. And so here I'm thinking both of local and national recipient governments, who at the end of the day need to be there to make it work, or at least allow for a governance framework that allows for implementation to work. And so donors can strengthen civil society or the private sector as much as they want, but when recipient governments or informal traditions are aligned or don't buy into the changes, then they form bottlenecks, and then it really makes change difficult. So, and I feel like in the debate around the SDGs, that recognition is there and important.
So maybe a follow-on to that.
Yeah.
Because in the book you shy away from saying which one's more effective. And I, and probably just about anyone I work with in this industry, you know, reads the book, says, tell me which one's better.
Right.
You know, but what means better is very different to different people. But certainly one concept that we talk about a lot is sustainability. Right. And I think that you were starting to hint at that when in your answer about the way that people are talking about the sustainable development goals and a bit differently from the MDGs. And so without saying effectiveness, but maybe sustainability, I'm curious, like in your interviews, did people talk about one versus the other in terms of sustainability? Or do you think that there are implications for sustainability regardless of how one might want to measure effectiveness in a shorter period of time?
Yeah. I mean, this is you rightfully noted. This is not a study about aid effectiveness, but rather informing the debate indirectly, right? About the fact that comparing donors along one metric only is comparing donors, or is a bit like comparing apples and oranges, because in the development space, they want to maximize different things, and the origins for what they maximize in very broadly speaking, short versus long-term development, right, or delivery versus capacity building, is we need to think carefully, and we can't always compare the two. Now, on the issue of sustainability, it's also correct that I don't really use the term in the book, in part because it has different notions depending on who I talk to. And so when I go to the dictionary and look at the definition of sustainability, I find that its definition is the ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level. And so to me, and here is actually where we see differences across donor agencies, because some, and here I'm talking about traditional public sector donors, really think of sustainability with a heavy role attributed to the recipient or local governments, local or national. And so while sustainability in the managerial organization does not talk so much about the state, right, as a vital actor. And so I think going back to the PEPFAR example, the obvious counter question to a vertical health program is what happens when the program comes to an end and the US funding dries up? What happens to patients, future patients, doctors, clinics, and staff, and what system is left behind? And so the traditional public sector donors would often cite these kinds of vertical programs as one that, you know, are more likely to chop up the sector, be it health or education, into smaller units, but not ensuring that the route to sustainability is there. A critic from the French aid agency thought, for example, of the MDGs being a fantastic idea for rallying support behind foreign aid in donor countries, but also an ugly idea because it sort of diminishes the international development to thinking about aid as simply financing health clinics or water taps or doing these very sort of targeted projects, setting up schoolrooms and associating aid with that, rather than thinking about how the water sector needs to be strengthened or health sector more broadly, how to balance out competencies, appropriate control, public-private incentives, and the satisfaction of the people. And so So sustainability in that view, right, is more about system building than efficient aid delivery. And so it always entails or it assigns an important role to the recipient government. So there's different interpretations of what sustainability is.
So let me pivot on that a little bit
Yes.
to talk just about the idea of capacity strengthening.
Mm-hmm.
You set up the same comparison in your book where the bypass model donors and their agents are more focused on strengthening the capacity of non-governmental organizations, including perhaps private sector, but also non-governmental health clinics and education service providers and so on. Whereas the other side, the government engagement model, then focuses on strengthening the capacity of governments to provide these services. And one of the things that I wondered about is, we're recognizing that these donor governments have very different political economies, right? So in the US, it's not just that we use the bypass model in the countries where we're providing assistance in many cases, but the US, that comes from the fact that the US government also outsources a lot of their work. They're paying organizations like my own to actually implement programs overseas. And so I wonder, does it matter? Do we see these differences in the countries that we're assisting? So if we're working in a country where that government is modeling after a more neoliberal political economy, where we expect them to do more outsourcing and be more managerialist, does it actually make sense then that we're strengthening the capacity of non-governmental organizations? Because once the government can pay for it, they're still going to pay others to do it. Whereas there might be governments that expect to be more traditional public sector governments over time. And so we really should be focusing on strengthening their capacity as a full service, if you will, public sector government. Should we be thinking about those different political economies across the countries where we're working?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I actually, I did not include a variable that it sort of captures the type of the recipient economy. But now that you mention it, I think it would be a really neat and interesting thing to see how this would pan out empirically. So in the book, I distinguish across recipient governments mostly in the quality of governance, right? And other characteristics that capture different and relevant features for decisions to bypass and engage. But I'm not capturing the sort of the political economy or the type of economic system. The reason why this would be interesting and why I might just do this analysis is because there is research by a colleague, for example, Stephen Nelson at Northwestern, that does research on IMF lending practices and who shows both quantitatively and qualitatively that the IMF offers more favorable lending conditions to countries where government officials have a Western and managerial, more specifically educational background. So where there is affinity between the IMF and the recipient country leaders in how the political or the economic system should work. And so it's in his case, it's like a heuristic, right, to sort of capture the extent to which the recipient country will do or work, whether or not they will do well on the program and whether they implement it well. But this would be interesting also to see from a bilateral context and to see if there are a systematic relationship. Now, that said, Annette, I find it a bit difficult maybe to create that typology. Typologies in this case of recipient countries where there are already multiple donors and which face goal ambiguity, right, in terms of the market systems or the kinds of systems that they need to set up. Which to prioritize, mostly they're not really local solutions, right? In that regard, donors sort of pull them in different directions. And so that's maybe difficult for the measurement, but at the same time, the goal ambiguity is not necessarily a bad thing because it could potentially allow recipients to sort of pick and choose and make it their local solution. But in the end, I guess this could be a really interesting follow-on research project. How the market economy and how that shapes decision making of donors.
Yeah. And I think I think you're right that does a recipient country's current model affect the way that it receives and uses aid, but then also what path dependency is there. So,
Correct.
10 years from now or 20 years from now, are we going to see that countries in their health systems have a managerialist approach and end up outsourcing because so much of health provision, that capacity strengthening has happened in non-governmental organizations? So I think there's a what do we see now, but also a looking back now that we've seen how this difference plays out over time, what kind of path dependency is there for the political economy of governments? So you talked about local solutions. So I'm going to switch to asking you a little bit about locally led development. Very few members and guests at SID United States go through a day in our work without thinking about locally led development these days. And here I'm talking about locally led development in the broader sense, which is the idea that we should be moving decision-making and implementation for programs and policies closer to the communities and the countries where we're working. And so when I first started reading your book, I thought that the lens of locally led development would support a government engagement model more, that locally led has to mean, and again, this is sort of presuming that the recipient country is one that aspires to a more traditional public sector, but my thought was, wow, locally led must mean that we're giving budget support and that governments are in control. But then at the same time, as we bring into our goals for locally led development our additional objectives around inclusion and diversity, that often argues for a bypass model. I see many arguments in the industry that say we need to make sure that we're working outside of governments because then we have more control over whose voices we're including. We can make sure that civil society organizations are representing marginalized groups where the government might not. And so I really, one could say in the interest of locally led development, it should be bypass, or in the interest of locally led development, it should be government engagement. So I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts if you put that lens on it, or how else have you been thinking about this work because I think when you started this research, we weren't talking about locally led development in the way that it's really been emphasized in the last year or two.
Yeah, so again, this question or the definition or what localization means and what it entails, again, it depends on the donor perspective and where. So for example, when I talk about, for example, country ownership from the Paris Agenda, right, as one principle that really aims to put ownership or the origin of development in the recipient country context, when I use this as a starting point for what localization means, then the managerial donors will respond, pointing out that in their way, or their way of thinking about localization really is about engaging civil society actors, private actors, creating public-private partnerships, creating new innovative solutions that draw on multiple actors in countries and including, but not focusing on the recipient state. And so you see this debate that you just, or you didn't pitch this as a debate, but these different understandings of what local versus of what localization means. It varies across political donor political economy type. Now, where perhaps there is a bit less of divergence is when we try and distinguish between international implementers versus local implementers, right? You can imagine this in the private sector space or the not-for-profit space. And there, regardless of which donor type, there is a very strong tendency to prioritize aid to international NGOs. And so there are efforts in USAID, for example, I think Samantha Power, but also already under the initial USAID Forward program, right? There was a push to sort of promote localization in the non-state actor space. But these are very difficult processes, right? Because they would entail more uncertainty, right? Both from a government perspective, but in particular from these local organizations where the accountability system needs to be a little bit more flexible to incorporate a little bit more risk.
Yeah, great. All right, I have one more question for you, and then want to give you a couple minutes in case you have any last comments you want to make. We haven't gotten any questions from the floor, so I'm going to take that as a sign that people think my questions are good.
They are.
Well, I've also read the whole book, so, you know,
that's right.
To come up with good questions. So, you know, as a scientist, you know that when you come up with a theory and you have evidence to support your theory, the real test of the theory is what predictions would the theory make? And then, you know, does the evidence also support the predictions? So you finished this book just as COVID was coming on the scene. And as any good scientist, you said, so my work here, my theory would predict something about, you know, how donor countries would deliver COVID assistance. And so you say, I expect neoliberal donors, so the managerial donors, to focus more on the delivery of vaccines, ventilators, or face masks, and traditional public sector donors to make a greater investment in a country's health structure. So we're more than 2 years on. Did your prediction pan out?
I will say that anecdotal and preliminary evidence would suggest yes. And so I have not followed the COVID assistance across 23 DAC donors, but I have followed them on my country cases, because when you're in the weeds, it's easier to know where to go and follow. And so what we see, for example, in the US case, we see that COVID assistance really continues, or with the old tradition, that suggesting that it continues its emphasis on private sector engagement, multilateralism, and collaboration with local partners, including civil societies and faith-based organizations, grassroots organizations, among others. And so there is no, if you look at, for example, the US COVID-19 Global Response and Recovery Framework and the implementation plan that goes with it, there really is not a clear objective to collaborate with recipient government. There is some language, of course, about health system strengthening, support for information system improvement. But if we compare that to what has come out of the German and French context, it is very light on recipient government engagement. And so in Germany and France, there's a lot of multilateral engagement through through the vaccine delivery, but there are always and a significant number of programs that really target the health sector as a whole, rather than just focusing on the delivery of vaccines or things, emergency things. So I would argue that tentatively there is evidence in support, but I think for a systematic test, we have to wait maybe 1 or 2 more years before the data collection process across these 2 years and has been completed and is published.
Yeah, I also would imagine that, and the data may not be refined enough to test this, but that it would also evolve over time. I mean, at the beginning, we had no idea how big it was going to be. So I think at the beginning, maybe everybody was more focused on just the immediate, what do we need to do? And then over the longer term, I think we all said, this is a systematic problem. It's not going away. So it would also, to the extent that the data are available, be interesting to see how donors actually evolved in their thinking about how to deliver assistance for COVID. All right, we just have, we have a couple more minutes. Is there anything that you wanted to add? The question that I didn't ask, if not, but I just want to make sure you get the last word.
Yeah, well, thank you. So if one of the issues that I've been grappling with mostly is, how does my book sort of inform not just foreign aid and so people in the weeds, but like how does the sort of this book contribute to thinking about multilateralism, donor coordination, and sort of world politics in situations like where we have climate change posing incredibly complex problems that can only be solved multilaterally or in concert with others, or the fact that we have fragile states, countries like Afghanistan were not able to, where solutions have not been found, right? And so thinking about what these moments or these challenges mean for how donors can act perhaps differently to solve these problems. And so what I show in the book is that there are these ideological differences make coordination hard.
Right.
And if we go out in the field, there is very little coordination in fragile states, for example, across donors. It's all the mindset continues to be very bilateral. But by understanding the comparative advantages of donors and thinking of donor agency as in a complementary way, right? The short run, the sort of the results delivery short run is just as important as the capacity building long run. And so really trying to move towards a more integrated approach that allows donors to maybe even coordinate at the country level in terms of strategy, right? And then really sort of offer a concerted solution to solving these real problems that have posed challenges for many years, and that there will be others. And so this is sort of question that I'm thinking that my book may offer possibilities for more collaboration, but it'll be difficult.
Yeah, but I like that framing, which is, you know, it's not about changing the way these countries behave. It's about how can we coordinate so that everyone can play to their strengths.
Correct, exactly. That's the idea. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much, Simone. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you to those of us who joined us today. The recording of this will be available to anyone, and we'll be promoting that as well. But I hope everybody has a good rest of your day wherever you are.
Thank you. Thanks for showing up.
Thank you to SID-US.
Thank you, Annette. Yeah. Bye.